Where does anybody go if you have a problem? Do you go to your teacher if you have a question? Well, how can you go to your teacher? Your teacher is a member of the party. Your teacher is one of those who is a watchdog for the ideology. Do you go to your doctor? How can you go to your doctor? Your doctor is being trained where? In a state-run hospital. Your doctor's phone is probably tapped. Where do you go? There is nowhere to go. And so in 1953, after Stalin's death, at an interview between Beria and Ignatieff, Beria who had assumed power, Pavel Beria, after Stalin's death, he was interviewing the former head of the KGB in the 1950s, before Stalin died, and he said, how many informants are there in the Soviet Union? And Ignatieff said, well, paid or unpaid? Unpaid, because all the paid informants were doing official work. The unpaid ones were doing the unofficial work of informing on their fellow citizens. And Ignatieff said, well, I believe, in my estimation, it must be around 10 million. 10 million, a country of less than 200 million people. It's 1 in 20 people. That means every time a professor gives a lecture to 100 students, probably 5 in that room to go back after class and make a telephone call. You see, there's nowhere you can go. There's nowhere in that world where you can go to express, and I'll give you one anecdote, which I know is true, and it had consequences. A very great historian, Natalia Lebedeva, in Russia, she's still alive today, overheard she was a student at the time of the Nuremberg trials, and she overheard a professor of hers who had been at the Nuremberg trial mention something about Katyn, just sort of by the way.
Why don't you tell the audience what that is?
Well, the Katyn Forest Massacre was a massacre of 20,000 approximately officers in the forest of Katyn. The Soviets blamed it on the Nazis, and the Nazis blamed it on the Soviets, and everybody knew that it had been done by the Soviets. And at Nuremberg, the Katyn massacre was supposed to come up, but it never did. The Allies never brought the subject of the murder of these 20,000 Polish officers up as a crime. At the time that it happened in 1940, it was one of the worst state-sponsored massacres in history. So Natalia hears her professor say something about Katyn, that it was squashed at Nuremberg, and she decides she's going to investigate it, and does. On her own, she starts burrowing into records of all sorts, and she finds things in the Soviet archives that are extremely compromising. And because they kept records of everything. And she discovered what they already knew, which was that the Soviet Union was responsible for the Katyn massacre. So she writes her dissertation on this subject, and she hands it in to her professor, and the professor reads it. Now, you have to remember, this is the 70s. This is under Brezhnev now. And in horror, he slams it down, and he says, burn this book. Never show this to anybody. Never. And you are never to speak of this in my presence again. Now get out of here. She didn't burn that book. She kept it hidden. And when Gorbachev came to power, she asked for a meeting with Gorbachev, because by that time she was already a distinguished professor. And she gave him this, and she said, read this, please. You must read this. And that was what prompted the investigation of Katyn and Gorbachev's eventual agreement to release the Katyn to the Polish government because of her. But at the time, you see, she went to somebody she thought she could trust. She went to her professor. But you see, you couldn't, not in that system. There was nobody.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.